movie in my head. I just thought this would be fun title. So actually, you can go to the next slide, Linda. Part of with this whole workshop that I'm going to be presenting on is I realized in my own recovery that I would be so creative at creating stories in my head. You know, I didn't know why I did that so much. I didn't know why I had such a difficult time detaching from that. But what I came to realize throughout my recovery is part of what I have on here is how I experienced each one of my experiences from childhood on up to my adult life. But primarily, probably the biggest amount for me that had an impact was those first 17, 18, 19 years of life. But how I experienced them created my perceptions. And because nobody else experienced those, just me, they are my unique perceptions. So they also then affected how I thought today. You know, what I came to learn in my recovery is my thoughts create my feelings. So that then created my feelings. And then between the two of those, that determined how I was going to act and behave out there in the world. You can go to the next slide. So a little bit on that. I have my notes on down here, but this is all nice. I could just read from here. A little bit on that. It's when I would go into those perceptions that were based on my experiences, again, I would create this movie that was going on. I would assume what you were thinking. I would assume what was going on or where people were at or what I was supposed to do. I was kind of a chameleon as part of my codependence. And so depending on what group of people I was in, I would try to fit in with them and, you know, kind of talk like they talked. If I, you know, I would go into this whole play acting thing because I had no clue of who I was inside. You know, part of my codependence recovery has been that gift of being able to discover who I am and truly what my thoughts and perceptions are for me today. So that movie in my head, though, created a level of fantasy and expectations and assumptions. You know, so I would make up things of, you know, like I said, like how I thought you would want me to be. I would think of how God wanted me to be, you know, or how it's supposed to show up. I mean, I could go through that list and be creative over and over and over again in that I would, those of you, I don't know, I know for myself, I would experience a lot of triggers, you know, in my recovery. And part of what I realized is that when something would happen, I could be watching a movie or I could be talking to a person or I could just be being by myself. You know, and one thing that is so amazing to me with codependence is we can just be codependent all by ourselves with this whole inner world that's going on. You know, doesn't even have to involve another person. But when triggers would happen, is automatically I would go into my perception of what I thought that meant. Now, my perception was based on my experiences, so your perception about that same event may be a totally different thing, or another person's perception about that same event may be a totally different thing. And so I realized that this was an inside job. My triggers were mine. They weren't anybody else's responsibility to not trigger me, to deal with my triggers, to anything. They were 100% my responsibility in that. And so as I was going through that, you know, I realized that all of those things and how I got triggered whatever my perceptions were based on my experiences, they then affected how I thought about things in the here and now. You can go to the next slide. Thank you, Linda. So again, my experiences physically, emotionally, intellectually, sexually, spiritually, and more importantly, how I experienced it. You know, I truly believe that I came into, you know, this existence with my own little personality, whatever that was. And then I met the dysfunction in my family. And so I morphed some of that personality into the way that I survived that. But you could probably, if I have two older sisters, probably have asked them how they experienced some of the same things that I experienced, and they may have a little bit of different take on that, because they were different people. How they experienced it was a little bit differently. But I realized that, you know, when looking at like our first step with the powerlessness, all of this to me is that whole place around what I am powerless over. I can't go back and change my history. I can't go back and redo any of the things that happened to me as a child. But what I can do is begin to address the perceptions and the beliefs that I had that came out of that. So the next slide. So part of our experiences, just to talk a little bit about that, from in the CoDA Blue Book, chapter 3, under step 1, there's a list of questions there. So I'll read through them and you can kind of just think about them while I'm reading through. You don't need to do any writing at this point. So the first one, what neglect and abuse did I experience growing up? So for me, I absolutely experienced a lot of abuse. My father had sexually abused me most of my childhood. My mother was a rager and violent. There was a lot of just dysfunctional interactions that happened in my family. One of my ways of dealing with my family is I would hide under my bed or hide in my closet, or I would sneak out my bedroom window. I was an escape artist. And so part of the neglect and the abuse that I experienced created a part of me that believed that the only way to deal with things was to be an escape artist. And so I created that perception that that's how you deal with stress. So where did I learn to turn my head when I or other people were being neglected or abused, and why? On that question for myself, part of what I would witness in my family, as I said, my mother was violent, and she was violent with one of my sisters, probably more than my other sister and I. And I remember watching that and feeling torn. It's like I wanted to do something. But I was the youngest. I was terrified of my mom. I didn't know how to intervene. I didn't know what to do. And so part of what that set up inside of my head for me is sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. You know, so things would happen in my life and I wouldn't quite know how then to go about addressing it, because I felt like if I went this way, this might happen. If I went this way, something else might happen. And that, you know, I see my codependence as a fear addiction. And so I would be bouncing back and forth between fears, just like I did as a little kid, trying to figure out if there was any way to help my sister. The next question, who in my childhood displayed these behaviors or instructed me not to tell or share my feelings about it? For me, both my parents, there was just no talking about feelings. We could be happy, As kids, that was the only thing we were supposed to, supposed to share with within our family. If we had any other feelings going on, there would be abuse or punishment in connection with it. So early on, definitely there was a place of not talking about feelings. I remember one time I was in, I think I was 11 years old, and there was a boy that I was interested in. And I really liked this boy, and his dad ran the pharmacy that was near our home, where my mom would go and get, we would all go and, there was medicines we needed. And my mom took a lot of prescription drugs, and so she was in that pharmacy a lot. So his dad worked there. Well, my mom didn't want me to date this boy because she thought that he wasn't part of a good group. And so I think she called him, the term she used was he was a hood. And so I told my boyfriend, my mom said, I can't see you because she thinks you're a hood. Well, of course, he told his dad. So then my mom goes in to get her prescription. His dad says something to my mom, and I paid a huge price for that, because we don't talk, we don't tell. We keep everything a secret in my family. And my mom was very rageful about that. So the next one, where did I learn that avoiding others was safer than being involved? Similarly with the examples that I've given, for me, my history just drove me into being in avoidance. I was the youngest. As I said, I was an escape artist. I tried to avoid my mom's rage any way that I could. I would make sure the house, try to pick up the house, try to do things that my mom wouldn't be angry when she got home from work. And that never worked on that. And plus my sisters would argue and fight with each other. And so I would stay away from them. I just was good at avoidance. And then in relationships, as I got older, that was part of what I did too. When Ken and I were together, I was always kind of 1 foot in the relationship, 1 foot out of the relationship. And it's like at any given moment, I was ready to run. And I remember, this was before CoDA started, but I remember our therapist saying I was not allowed any longer to say I was going to leave the relationship unless I did it inside the therapist's office. Because that was just, I'd get afraid and I was going to leave. I'd get afraid I was going to leave. And there are many stories about that. But part of what that did in our relationship is Ken was always, okay, is she here? Is she not? Is she going? Is she not? And so he came from a lot of abandonment, and he would experience abandonment every time that I would say something like that. So the next one, where did I learn to control others for my sense of well-being? So my way of controlling others is I would try to placate people. I would become compliant. I would be a yes person. I would go along with the flow. I wouldn't want to make waves, anything in any way, in order to not have anybody be upset with me. And so I was incredibly controlling. I used to get told over and over and over again that I was very nice. And I got to where I did not like that word, because I knew inside I wasn't. Inside, I was terrified. I was judging. I was, trying to figure out how to manipulate my way out of any given situation. It wasn't anything that, that to me was of value in that way. So the next question, how did I learn that I wasn't good enough or was better than others? So, part of what I learned about, with toxic shame, we talk about that a lot in the program. And for me, what I came to find out is that the only way toxic shame was created is that I either witnessed or experienced abuse, abandonment, neglect, or enmeshment, that was the only way that was created. And so in the management of that toxic shame, also what I learned is that I would go one or two ways. I would either go shameless and deny my shame, judge others, think that I knew what others needed, be controlling, all those types of things, or I would become very shameful and kind of have that shame wall around me. I know that when I would end up with that shame wall, so if Ken would say anything to me that I even had the hint of any criticism or confrontation attached to it, the shame wall would come up. And it's like, I know I'm bad, I'm wrong, I can't do this right, what's wrong with me, I would blah, blah, all this kind of stuff. And there was no way that he could communicate with me when I had that shame wall up. It was huge control. And so probably the majority of the time, that was my main defense, is I would go into shame and then nobody was going to be able to say anything to me with that, because I would react with out of that shame. And then at times with going into that better than, that was when I would think that I knew what Ken needed. I knew what my kids needed, especially after they were adults. I knew what they needed. I would do that with friends. I would do that with people. I would get into judgment in there. And mainly because I judged myself, I would get into judging others in that, and coming from that place that I thought I knew what was best for them. So when CoDA was in its early stages and I was in my early stages, with recovery, we would have our service conferences. And it was when Ken and I were still involved with the board and still directly involved with the service conference. And there were times if I thought somebody was going to hurt, CoDA in any way, my judgmental mind would kick up and I would want to say something during the conference, and so then I would speak up, but it was all from this, like I knew what was the right thing, even at that level. And so part of recovery with codependence is learning the spiritual value of a group conscience vote, allowing my higher power to be in control of my life instead of me to be playing God, allowing my higher power to be the guidance in my life instead of having shame walls or fear walls. It's been, the recovery process is just tremendous to me. So the next question on here. So when, where, and how did I learn to deny my thoughts, my feelings, my needs for the sake of others, or conversely, to demand that they would revolve around me? So I think some of those examples that I just gave around the shame wall, I would end up going into that. That was probably the strongest way that, again, that I would deny my own thoughts and feelings in my mind for the sake of others. And it's like, to me, that was so incredibly, oh my gosh, how do I say, shameless in there, because I would go into this victim martyr place. It's like, okay, I'll give up myself for you, and which is crazy and so dysfunctional in there, instead of showing up and being authentically who I was. The next one, where did I learn to behave in neglectful and or abusive ways that are intellectually, emotionally, physically, sexually, or spiritually harmful? So part of what was also that I learned throughout my recovery is that as I experienced any abuse, abandonment, neglect, or enmeshment, intellectually, emotionally, physically, sexually, or spiritually, that I would do one of three things. I would grow up, I would either become somebody who did similar things of what was done to me, or I would be attracted to somebody who was going to do similar things to me, or I would do them to myself. And sometimes I would do that plus other, one of the other two. And so the cycle would go on and on and on. And I wouldn't recognize that, I had the power to stop that cycle, that I was continuing that cycle going on because I stayed with what felt familiar, and learning that that word comes from the word family. So this next one, where and how did I learn that having a relationship would make me whole? So I grew up in the days of fairy tales and Sleeping Beauty, and Prince gonna kiss Sleeping Beauty and she's gonna wake up, and then all the I loved old movies, so I would watch the 1940s movies and 1950s movies, and I was born in 53, so all the movies after that, and just loved love stories, loved those, that idea that there was going to be a male that would come in and save me and take me away and make me whole, and we would become one. And all the music I listened to, I mean, I could go on and on, all the influences, but it was all in order to fix that pain and that woundedness that was inside that I had, primarily with that in the relationship that I had with my father. I was always looking for somebody to fill that hole in there, and thinking that a relationship would be the answer to that. So, I got married for the first time at 16, got married the second time at 19, and obviously divorced, and was divorced at 25, and then got married again at age 30 with Ken and I. And because of recovery, solely because of recovery, we've been together for over 38 years. And that is just remarkable with that. So these are a few of the questions that are in chapter 3. It's a short list and there's more questions in there, but it is so important to be able to go back and get that information. It's like, okay, where did this come from in there? So we can go to the next slide, Linda. So again, our experiences created our perceptions and beliefs about ourselves, about others, about life. They're going to be unique to us. And, like I was saying, I came into this world with my little personality that was there. So how I interpreted those things that were happening to me, the messages I attached to them, the beliefs I attached to them are totally mine. Nobody else is going to be able to understand me. They can relate to me, they can kind of connect with me in different areas, but nobody experienced those except me. And so nobody is ever going to be able to understand me. And that was such a huge piece for me to get, because I cannot tell you how many times I would tell Ken, I just want you to hear me and understand me. Well, I'm asking for him to do something that is absolutely impossible, So in that, when I would look at that, it was, again, another way to have fantasy, that somehow somebody was going to understand me. I barely understood me. So I don't know how anybody else is going to understand me. But anyway, so I had to really address that inner filter that was inside. So I refer to it as Windows 53, because I was born in 1953. So that's my computer programming in there. But the good news with it is that by going through and really identifying all my perceptions and beliefs that came out of the things that I experienced or witnessed, I could change them. I could start creating new perceptions and beliefs for myself that were something that were healthier. So next slide. So our thoughts. So all those perceptions and beliefs, anytime something then happened in my life today, the only place that I had to go to filter how I would think about something was my perceptions and beliefs, was my Windows 53. And so I couldn't figure out why I kept repeating the same cycles over and over and over again. Was until I started addressing those, I wasn't going to be able to change them. My thoughts create my feelings. And so in that is if I didn't change the way that I was thinking, nothing in my life was going to change. If I didn't start addressing what those perceptions and beliefs were, then my thoughts weren't going to change. I was still going to feel the same way I felt then. I had gone through and done a therapeutic process. It's called shame reduction work. And so it's a way to deal with the toxic shame that I had taken on from the shamelessness from my parents and others that were in my life. And so part of that shame reduction work was to release the shame and clear it out, and energetically, emotionally, all of that. But what happened is that I didn't change my perceptions and beliefs. So shame feels like shame. So it doesn't matter if I had gone through and cleared out old shame. If I was still having shameful thoughts and beliefs about myself, I was just feeling shame again. And so I couldn't figure out, I felt for a period of time in my codependence recovery, I felt like I can't get past this shame piece. You know, I'm still hard on myself. I'm still putting myself down. I couldn't figure out what it was and why I couldn't get past that until I started addressing, you know, where that came from. So the good news in all of this is we can change our perceptions and beliefs, and we can change our thinking. We are powerless over our histories and what happened to us, what we experienced, what we witnessed, but we can change what occurred as a result of that. So the next slide. So again, you know, my thoughts create my feelings. I always thought it was the other way around, that I would have feelings and then I'd have thoughts created to the feelings. And then I found out that no, the thoughts happen first, and then there's feelings, and there's more thoughts, then there's feelings, and there's more thoughts, and there's, you know, kind of just, you know, the snowball effect. And the more that I would think dysfunctional things, if I was angry with somebody and I just started jacking up a story in my head, pretty soon I went from anger to rage. You know, it's like it would escalate. You know, if I was afraid, you know, afraid to talk to somebody, or afraid to, I used to be terrified to get up and in meetings and speak. You know, I would sit there, and half the time when I first started sharing in Alcoholics Anonymous, I would share, cry, share, cry, share, cry. You know, it's about as much as I could do with that, you know, because I was terrified. But as long as I kept the story around terrifying myself going, of course, that's all I felt. You know, if I'm going to scare myself, naturally, I'm going to feel fear. If I'm going to shame myself, naturally, I'm going to feel shame. If I'm going to guilt myself for some, you know, for something, then of course I'm going to feel guilt. I mean, my thoughts create my feelings, and so some of what I learned about feelings is that, and this is how I work with it, but it's just that feelings are a kinetic response that our body has to stimulus, and that stimulus being my thoughts, my perceptions, my beliefs. So if I don't like the way I feel, I need to change the way I think. So simple, so hard, and so simple, because I don't know about you guys, but my Windows 53 was like ingrained in me. And so I could go, okay, all I got to do is change my thinking, but it just wasn't that easy. It took a lot of practice and time, and every time those thoughts would come up, I'd need to intervene on them as soon as I noticed them and change them with healthy thoughts. You know, we've got some great pamphlets in CoDA that has to do with affirmations and the way we think and perceive things that are so helpful. So the next slide. Thank you, Linda, so much. You're so good at this. So again, if we don't like the way we feel, we need to change the way we think. Next slide. So then that whole combination, so my thoughts, my feelings are all going to determine then what I do out there. So my actions and behaviors. So, you know, that's going to make the difference on whether my behaviors are going to be mindful and I'm going to really be conscious of my behaviors, or are they going to be reactive? When I came to learn for myself that, you know, the moment that I would get into some of those old perceptions and beliefs and thoughts, all of that, and I would get reactive, what I learned is it took me into this whole survival part of my brain. And so the only thing I'm going to do is want to survive. Pretty much for me, surviving meant I was going to react. Now, sometimes I could be around people and they had no clue I was reacting inside. But inside there was all this stuff going on, all this chaos going on. But on the outside, I learned in survival how not to show that. Because if you showed that, something bad was going to happen. And so I learned really hard as a little kid not to show that there was a lot going on inside of me. I learned how to be needless and wantless and be independent, take care of myself, not ask anybody for anything. So nobody had a clue on what was going on inside of me. And when I'm able to be mindful of what my perceptions and beliefs are, be mindful then of the resulting thinking and making sure that those thoughts are healthy, that they're love-filled, that they're empowering, that they're affirming of myself and of you, then I'm able to be more conscious about how I act and behave. Then I'm able to access what I've learned, a part of my brain that is where our wisdom comes from, and our mindfulness and our ability to connect with God, to connect with love and perceive what love really is. So when I'm able to come from that conscious place, I'm also able to have boundaries. So a little bit on boundaries with that for, you know, that I learned is boundaries are all about how I self-care. You know, I've heard descriptions of boundaries that just didn't work for me, that they were more about, you know, kind of like limitations and guidelines and all of that kind of stuff. And so that didn't quite work for me. I needed to go from, okay, so from that place, you know, I call it my loving self-parent is my boundaries. So from that loving self-parent, that part of me needs to show up in a conscious way, in a mindful way, in an empowered way, a love-filled way, respectful way, and state what maybe my limits are, what is okay and not okay for me to experience. But it's not necessarily, for me, boundaries aren't about walls. And so from that conscious place, I was able to share my boundaries with others a little bit at a time. You know, I really had this battle of going from being able to be conscious and mindful in my thoughts and my actions and my behaviors, which my feelings then just kind of resonated along. They were much more responsive than reactive when I would do that. And then I would, bounce over as I was learning into more that reactionary, old perceptions, old beliefs, old thoughts, that would create more reactionary feelings. And then I would be boundaryless. I would either be boundaryless or I'd have walls, one or the other. But that would be totally unconscious. And that helped me a lot to be able to kind of like, when I felt a little bit out of sorts, quite not sure how to address something, part of what I do for myself is I would ask myself, like, how would my higher self view this? How would my higher self, teach this loving self-parent and help her to see, how to be mindful and conscious in my life? And always I would get a good answer. And if I didn't know, I had phone numbers of people I could call. When CoDA first started, we, of course, there weren't any sponsors because CoDA just started. So we were doing a lot of co-sponsoring with each other. So I had a couple women that I would call that I could run things by, that I could, we would do that for each other, and we helped each other get through the steps and all of that. And so I could pick up the phone and call somebody, and so what was really helpful for me, again, going back to my first step, I was powerless over my experiences. There's no way those were going to change. The unmanageability would kick in when I wasn't then addressing my old perceptions, beliefs, the resulting thoughts, the resulting reactive feelings, and the resulting behaviors. And so my unmanageability and, the patterns and characteristics, all of my codependents would just start showing up from all of that. But as with recovery, the good news is we can change those things. We don't have to stay stuck there. So the next slide. So now we're going to do a little bit of a writing assignment. Am I doing on time? Okay, good. So get out a pen and paper if you have that. And Linda, if you could go to the next slide. So I don't, there's going to be 3 slides that have some of the writing assignment on it. But to begin with, this one is that you write down, we'll take a few minutes while you do this, but write down 2 of your beliefs and perceptions, physically, and then emotionally, and then sexually, and then intellectually, and then spiritually, and then also what women are, what men are, and what relationships are. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes to be able to write that down, and then I'll give you the next piece of the writing assignment.
Okay, so my clock says 10:53. We'll go to 11:53. Mary, we have a question asking for clarification about what specifically they should write about: physical, emotional, sexual, intellectual, etc.
Sure. So physical belief or perception. So physical would be, looking at yourself, your physical body. Just keep it that simple in there. So what are beliefs and perceptions? So part of, I can share something from my own history. Part of my perceptions about myself physically was that I was in a lot of sports. My dad was a coach, and so I had to do a lot of sports. So I always had to be physically fit. I always had to make sure I was, able to stay physically strong, physically fit. Nobody ever really got into how to eat right. You just had to make sure you were a certain weight. So I learned how to have eating disorder as a result of that. and not take care of myself real good physically. But as long as I showed up physically fit, then I was okay. There were also messages when I grew up about that you were supposed to look a certain way, dress a certain way, be a certain way. And so there were certain perceptions that I had about myself of how I was supposed to look and fit in with the rest of the girls at school, with what the movies were saying, what magazines were saying, you know, that kind of thing. Does that help? Tell me if that part isn't clear, let me know. So this piece of it, you may have or you may not have, and we're not going to write about it today, but I wanted to include it in there. But it's helpful to look at who, what, when, where, and how did I learn these perceptions and beliefs. And so, you know, some of the questions I was sharing with you from chapter 3, step 1, you may get some of the answers to that in there. You know, what I had learned with a really good first step is not only looking at the powerlessness and the unmanageability, but also asking this question. And so bringing in some of the childhood pieces and being able to look at those to see where the core of my codependence began to develop and how that developed. So I would just encourage you, because that's a much longer writing assignment, we're not going to do that, but I just wanted to share that with you, that is, I found that to be incredibly helpful. So the next slide, which we will be doing writing on. So what you're going to do, because it's the same list as what we had before, is now what I want you to do is to write down a healthy perception and belief, something that you would like to believe that is different from what it is that you learned to believe. And to begin to create, it's a way to begin to create some healthy messages for yourself and to identify what you would like those to look at. So we're going to take, if you have any questions, please, on how to do this, please raise your hand and I'll be glad to answer those. But what we'll be doing is taking probably another 10 minutes to be able to go through and write those as well. And then when we come back, what we'll be doing is opening it up as a group for sharing. So those of you who are wanting to share, or if you have questions, of course, we'll go through that, but just to be able to open it up for sharing for everybody. Helped was is in writing all the old beliefs and perceptions and thoughts down, and then coming up with new ones, is to take the new list. This is what I did, and I went and I recorded them. Back then it was on cassette tapes, for those of you who remember cassette tapes. And then I would listen to them a couple times a day. And so some of what happened for me is it started to help me be able to intervene on those old messages and replace them with new ones. You know, it definitely was a challenge. Like I was saying earlier, you know, there was this kind of battle that would go on between the two for a while, but the longer I kept staying committed, it's like, you know, my willingness was there. I would pray about it. It's like I wanted to think differently. I didn't want to stay in those old beliefs and those old perceptions, and the way I looked at myself and looked at you and looked at life. You know, those all had created so much pain for me. And so I was really committed to changing those. Sometimes what would happen that I noticed with myself is like the areas that were the toughest for me to change. So the beliefs that were the toughest, and, you know, and that would show up for me because I would have a hard time really integrating the new thoughts. in there. So those I realized were kind of tied to more my core wounds that I had. So the woundedness that, you know, from the sexual abuse with my father, you know, I had so many different messages, you know, that was my purpose, that was my job, that was, you know, I didn't have any rights to my body, didn't have any rights to, you know, my thoughts about that or my wants or desires. And so those took a little bit more for me to change, you know. And now, thank God I had you know, Ken was in recovery, and so he was open to me practicing with that. And I know we don't talk about sex a whole lot in meetings, but I think it's important because there are a lot of people who struggle with how to repair their sexual relationship. And so we communicated, you know. And so at any given time, for me, if I was uncomfortable in any way because maybe a memory had come back, especially in those early days, we had an agreement that we could stop, talk, deal with it, and help it to heal, and it did, you know. And so, you know, I'm very grateful to Ken and his willingness in all of that. But it, you know, it's like it takes what it takes with all these messages. Some of them are going to be more ingrained, at least I found for myself, than others. Some I was able to change easily. You know, so I really encourage, you know, everybody, or, you know, at least it worked for me, but to practice really intervening on those messages, doing the best, you know. I kept telling myself, you know, I need to just do the best job that I can with that. There's no perfection. One thing that I know with us as human beings is that we are, you know, I am talking for myself, I am fallible and make mistakes, and definitely was a struggling work in progress in my early years, and I am still a work in progress. There are still things that I can get triggered with, but part of what happens today is that I recognize it faster, I grab onto the tools faster, and I get out of it faster, you know, and then I move on, and then there's greater and greater period in between incident, you know. And to me, that's living life on life's terms. That's living as a functional, healthy human being. You know, I give myself, this is just something I do with myself, but I give myself, if I can be functional and healthy 80% of the time, man, that's a thumbs up, you know, because that's huge, you know, from where I was dysfunctional probably 99% of the time before, you know, being able to maintain something that is in that 80% range is huge for me. And so, you know, over time, you know, over and over and over again, you know, I believe in choosing faith and love over that fear of changing, you know, and I've got that in here. I had to, for me, you know, in working my third step, which was really a hard step for me, it came in increments. While I was going from that 99% dysfunctional and starting to get a little more functional, a little more functional, a little more, as I was going through that, more and more I could trust my higher power, because as codependence is a conflict in gods, where I can make fear my God, or I can make you my God, or I can make my job my God, or I can make my child my God. You know, I could make shame my God, or my history my God, where I could give so much attention to all those different things to give me my value and worth. Really trusting that my higher power loved me unconditionally, wanted the best for me, that I could trust every single outcome to my higher power, came in increments. You know, came a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. You know, I wanted to be there, but I had to, it's like the more that I worked through, for me, the more I worked through my childhood issues and dealt with the emotions around them, understood, this whole workshop, understood the perceptions and beliefs that came out of that, changed those, practiced new behaviors, communicated, learned how to communicate, learned how to have boundaries, learn all those different things. The more that I could show up for me, the more I felt safe to trust in a higher power. And for me, it had to begin to show up there first. The more loving I was with myself, the more I was open to receiving God's love for me, that I was open to then also receiving others' love for me, but I had to do, that whole thing with codependence recovery, that it's an inside job. I had to do that so much over and over and over again in my life. And to me, the good news in all of this is that we do get to have healthy, fulfilling, loving relationships with ourselves and others. I get to have a healthy, fulfilling, loving relationship with my higher power, which is at the core of everything for me. That is first and foremost my main relationship. So I wanted to read something. So Linda, I was going to ask you if you could go to the next slide. This is from in chapter 3 in the CoDA Blue book, Clear at the End. There's a section in there that's the journey continues. And so I wanted to read this and be able to end with this. We might be a few minutes ahead, but through God's abundant love, the spiritual principles of our program, and our willingness to be rigorously honest in continuing our recovery to the best of our ability, we will come to know a new sense of belonging. We will begin to trust and believe in ourselves, and that the healing of our past is possible. We'll no longer be controlled by fear and shame. We will find we are able to respond to life's challenges with courage, integrity, and dignity. Others will no longer be our gods. We will experience a new love and acceptance of ourselves and others. We will become capable of developing and maintaining healthy and loving relationships, and we will learn to see ourselves as equal to others. We will learn that it's possible for our families to mend and become more loving and intimate. We will come to know that we are each a unique creation of a loving higher power, born with beauty, value, and worth. And we will progressively experience spiritual strength and serenity in our daily lives. Thank you all for being here. God bless you all. Thank you.